cabin, we were finishing up a late-night strategy session by the fireplace. I was sipping my coffee half, listening to my buddy Dan talk about a training course he ran last month for rookie SWAT recruits, when a sharp knock sliced through the calm like a blade. 3 loud, deliberate knocks. We all froze. Dan raised an eyebrow and set his cup down quietly on the table. James, our quietest friend and a retired Navy SEAL, was already reaching for the concealed Glock beneath the coffee table. The knock came again, this time louder, more impatient. I exchanged a glance with the others. We weren't expecting anyone. No neighbors for miles. Cell reception was patchy at best out here, which is exactly why I bought this cabin. A retreat from the madness of city life and more recently, from the chaos stirred up by Karen and her HOA crusade. Dan moved to the window and peered through a slit in the blackout curtain. 2 guys, he whispered, dressed like cops, cruiser outside. I stood and walked quietly toward the front door, keeping my steps silent against the hardwood floor. Something didn't sit right. The uniforms looked almost right, but the posture was off. Real cops don't stand like that. Hands fidgeting, too stiff, not scanning their surroundings properly. Real cops don't keep their hands near their belts like that, unless they expect something. And then, there was the cruiser. From the edge of the curtain, I spotted the patrol car. Too clean. No dirt on the tires. No numbers on the side. Even the lights on top looked like they'd just been snapped on. A prop, maybe. I glanced at James, who'd moved into position by the side hallway. We didn't need words. We'd all done too many real ops to miss fake ones. I spoke through the door, firm but calm. "Can I help you, officers?" One of them responded quickly, voice tense. "Sir, we received a report of suspicious activity at this cabin. Open up so we can take a look around." Wrong protocol. No request for ID, no asking if anyone was injured, no call-outs to announce themselves clearly, not even a badge number. "You mind holding your badge up to the peephole?" I asked, already knowing what was coming. There was a pause. "Then, sir, open the door now, or we'll be forced to enter by law." Bingo, the last nail in their fake cop coffin. I turned and gave Dan the silent signal. He slipped into the hallway and activated the silent lockdown system we'd installed a year ago. Originally for training, but also, let's be honest, partly because Karen had been escalating her antics from nasty letters to late night prowlers. Within seconds, the main doors locked with a heavy clunk. Steel deadbolts, reinforced glass, windows turned opaque, and the outdoor floodlights lit up the entire perimeter. A hidden camera feed blinked on inside, giving us full visuals of the 2 imposters outside. That's when we saw it. The guy on the left, short, stocky, nervous, was wearing his belt wrong. His radio was on the wrong frequency band, and his badge, it was a Halloween store replica. We'd confiscated dozens like it in past raids. The second guy looked even more panicked, checking over his shoulder every few seconds. Not exactly what you'd expect from officers trained to handle domestic disturbances. "Get ready," James said under his breath. I nodded and stepped back toward the kitchen, where we kept a satellite phone just in case. I dialed the sheriff's personal line. He owed me a favor after we helped train half his team last summer. He picked up fast, and after a quick rundown, he was dispatching real backup. Meanwhile, outside, the fake cops were growing restless. One reached for his hip, possibly to try the handle. The door wouldn't budge, and with every second that passed, the red light blinking above the porch made it clearer. This cabin wasn't some random lakeside hideout. It was a trap, a well-designed, tactical, SWAT-ready trap. They came dressed like cops. But they were about to meet people who trained them, ChatGPT said. 2 weeks before that knock on the cabin door, Karen had reached her breaking point. It started, as it always did, with a petty complaint. This time, it was about the gravel path we'd added beside the cabin. Unauthorized landscaping, she called it. Never mind that the cabin sat outside the HOA jurisdiction. Never mind that we had legal documentation proving it. Karen, self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association, believed her imaginary crown extended well beyond her gated community. The final straw for her came at the last HOA meeting, where she'd tried to rally the board to push for forced access to properties around the lake for safety inspections. It was her thinly veiled way of saying she wanted to poke around our cabin. I'd attended the meeting out of sheer curiosity, wearing a plain sweatshirt and jeans, trying to keep a low profile. But that didn't stop her. She stood at the podium, pointing fingers, describing us as potentially dangerous survivalists who were arming themselves for who knows what. What she didn't realize, or didn't care to understand, was that we were former law enforcement, military vets, and tactical trainers. My friends and I had built careers on protecting people like her. The irony stung, but it also amused us. She was laughed out of the meeting. Even her closest puppet, Greg from Lot 12, refused to second her proposal. People were tired of her nonsense, and when I quietly stood up and reminded the board that our cabin was protected under different zoning laws, then showed them a map and a notarized exemption, it was over. At least I thought it was. The next day I noticed a pair of strangers parked across the lake road. They didn't get out, just sat there, sunglasses on, pretending to scroll their phones. I walked out to grab firewood and watched as the car pulled away slowly, engine too quiet for an old sedan. Then came the drone, small, no lights, flying lower than it should have been. It hovered for almost 3 minutes above our roof before vanishing into the trees. We laughed it off at the time. Dan even joked that Karen had gone full Bond villain, but something about it made me uneasy. I should have trusted that instinct. What we later learned, through some well-placed questions and a helpful contact in county records, was that Karen had hired 2 men through a shady local security consultancy she found online. The kind that operated in gray areas, doing intimidation gigs for cash. She wanted to scare us out of the cabin, force some confrontation, and then claim we were dangerous aggressors. She told them we were illegally stockpiling weapons, and that the cabin was unregistered. She handed them fake documents, forged noise complaints, and even photoshopped images showing us training with firearms. Around kids taken entirely out of context from a SWAT family weekend 2 summers ago. Her plan: dress these guys up like local cops. Send them to the cabin late at night. Let them bang on the door, maybe even force their way in if we overreacted, or if something went sideways, she'd have it all documented. A staged show meant to trigger fear, confusion, maybe even arrests. She thought we'd panic. She thought we'd run. What she didn't know was that every inch of that cabin had been built with security in mind. Hidden trail cams, backup batteries, satellite link-ups. We weren't paranoid. We were prepared. It wasn't just a cabin. It was a training ground, designed over years by men who had seen what the world could do. Karen underestimated us. She always had. She thought uniforms and flashlights would be enough, but the real mistake wasn't underestimating the cabin. It was underestimating the people inside, and most of all, she didn't realize that we'd already been warned. Greg, the same neighbor who refused to support her HOA vote, called me the night before, said Karen had been ranting in her driveway to some sketchy guys in a black SUV. Said he overheard words like fake warrant and make it look official. I thanked him, hung up the phone, and immediately started preparing the cabin for lockdown. We didn't tell anyone else. We didn't run. We waited, because Karen had no idea that the men she sent were walking into a place designed to catch people exactly like them. ChatGPT said, inside the cabin, we moved like gears in a well-oiled machine. No shouting, no scrambling. Just quiet, precise action. While the 2 imposters waited outside, still pretending to be cops, the rest of us slipped into positions we'd rehearsed a dozen times before, though never for something like this. Dan moved upstairs to the overwatch point we'd built into the loft, flipping open the concealed window slot that gave him full visual coverage of the driveway and front porch. James silently disappeared toward the rear entrance, making sure the back perimeter sensors were active. I stayed near the front, watching the grainy night vision feed from the porch camera on a small wall-mounted screen in the kitchen. The two fake cops were getting impatient. One of them paced nervously, checking a phone he tried to keep hidden in his hand. The other kept glancing toward the woods across the dirt road, no doubt where their getaway driver was supposed to be. They looked more like burglars in borrowed costumes than law enforcement. Their body language screamed uncertainty. Too rigid, too nervous, and worst of all, too quiet. Real cops announce everything. They're trained that way. These guys barely spoke at all. That's when I knew they weren't just winging it. They'd been coached. Badly, but coached nonetheless. Karen must have handed them a plan and hoped they'd scare us into either fighting or fleeing. Either result would have given her the ammunition she wanted. A 911 call, a report, a scandal. But she'd made a fatal error. This wasn't just some old hunting cabin. This place was a SWAT evaluation site. Over the last 5 years, we'd hosted everything from advanced breacher courses to nighttime navigation drills here. We'd trained active law enforcement and military personnel. Behind the rustic charm, the timber beams, the vintage fireplace, the lake-facing porch, were reinforced doors, soundproof walls, and an integrated lockdown system powered by solar backup. Every window could be blacked out in under 2 seconds. Every entrance had a secondary barrier, and every room had at least one concealed weapon cache. Not because we were paranoid, because we were professionals. I tapped the screen and zoomed in on their name tags. One said S. Reeves, the other J. Martinez. I ran them through our offline officer database. Nothing. No local deputies by those names, no recent hires, just more confirmation of what we already knew. James's voice came through the internal radio. Movement behind the tree line, drivers repositioning, black SUV, probably running lookout. Copy, I replied. Let them sit. Let's give them just enough rope. Dan's voice followed. They're about to test the door. On the camera feed, I watched as one of the men, Reeves, took a step forward and tried the handle. Locked, solid, no give. He said something under his breath to the other guy, who shook his head nervously. Then came the knock again, louder this time, more aggressive. Final warning, open the door or we'll be forced to make entry. They had no warrant, no backup, no probable cause, just cheap uniforms and the illusion of authority. That's when I activated Protocol Gray. The entire cabin shifted, not visibly, not like in the movies, but subtly. Lights dimmed to 20%. Outside, motion sensors lit up the trail paths. At the rear, a hidden pressure sensor along the fence line triggered a slow, closing gate, locking down escape routes. Reeves didn't notice, he was too focused on the front. I tapped into the external speakers, disguised as old porch lights, and spoke clearly, calmly. This property is under active surveillance by county law enforcement and federal partners. You are in violation of multiple penal codes. Step back from the entrance and place your hands where we can see them. That was the first real moment of panic. Martinez backed up quickly. Reeves swore and looked around, trying to spot the source of the voice. They hadn't expected resistance, certainly not a voice coming from hidden speakers, not lights that adjusted automatically, and not a reinforced door that didn't even budge under pressure. Dan adjusted his scope upstairs. They're hesitating, waiting for orders. I grinned. Let's keep them waiting. We weren't going to make the first move. We didn't have to. This wasn't about catching them in the act anymore. This was about letting them dig their own grave while Karen watched from whatever hole she'd retreated to. The trap was set. The prey was in position, and the longer they lingered, the worse it would get. The man called Reeves was the first to crack. After I gave the warning through the external speakers, he stepped back, muttered something sharp to Martinez, and glanced toward the dark tree line. He was looking for guidance, maybe for Karen herself, or whoever was parked in that getaway SUV. But no help came. Only silence, only the cold weight of reality beginning to settle on their shoulders. Martinez shifted on his feet, like the ground had started burning beneath him. His hands hovered near his belt, unsure whether to draw something or raise them in surrender. They weren't trained for this. They hadn't expected a response like this, a voice from nowhere, surveillance from every angle, and a door that felt like it had been ripped from a fortress. Inside the cabin, we stayed still, watching. The tension wasn't in the air, it was in them. Every second ticked by like a countdown, and with each one, they grew more panicked. They didn't know what was behind the door, only that it didn't behave like a civilian residence. Then the SUV headlights blinked twice. A signal, it began reversing slowly, almost cautiously. Reeves noticed and stepped toward the front porch again, desperation flickering in his movements. He banged on the door with his fist. "Come on," he shouted, "just open up and let us talk. We don't want trouble." But trouble was exactly what they'd brought. Dan spoke over the internal radio. "They're falling apart. Want me to give them a little more motivation?" "Go," I replied. From his position upstairs, Dan activated the secondary protocol, not the full defense mode, just a little taste. On the porch, a red dot appeared suddenly on Martinez's chest, traced by one of our mounted infrared training lasers. Kind we used in SWAT exercises to simulate sniper overwatch. Martinez froze. Reeves turned in alarm and caught sight of the dot. Then Dan flipped on the outer floodlight, the brightest one, the one that turned night into day. It blasted the entire front yard in white brilliance. Now they were fully exposed. Martinez stepped back with hands up, trembling. Reeves hesitated for a moment, still holding on to the last sliver of his plan, before tossing it aside and following his partner's lead. I keyed into the external audio again, steady and slow, hands where we can see them, stay exactly where you are. Real officers are on their way. You are under surveillance, and this is your final warning. And then, through the silence of the trees, came the sound of tires on gravel, not the SUV. It had vanished into the woods. This was something else. Blue and red strobes began flashing through the darkness. The real sheriff's team had arrived. A black SUV marked County Tactical rolled to a stop near the driveway, another vehicle behind it, then a third. Out stepped Sheriff Haverson himself, a broad-shouldered man with a calm face and a Glock he rarely had to draw. He and I went way back. We'd trained as rookies last summer and had walked through this very property together, talking about tactical layouts. His deputies moved fast and clean. Within seconds, Reeves and Martinez were on the ground, zip-tied, weapons seized. There was no resistance, no protest. They didn't even try to lie. Sheriff Haverson approached me as I stepped onto the porch. He gave a nod, half smiling. "Heard you had some uninvited guests. They knocked?" I said, but forgot their script halfway through. We both looked toward the woods, where the drone of a chopper could now be heard approaching. The county had called in air support in case the suspects scattered into the forest. But the story wasn't finished yet. Inside the SUV that had fled, Karen had been riding along, watching everything unfold through a cheap phone app connected to a bodycam one of the imposters wore. She thought she was safe, that she'd keep her fingerprints off everything. What she didn't know was that the bodycam feed had been intercepted by us before the raid even began. Dan had been recording the entire stream, every word, every command she'd whispered, every time she told them to push harder, to just force the door, to make them look like aggressors. She was finished. An hour later, the sheriff's team tracked the SUV through drone surveillance and found it parked behind the tree line near an old service road. Karen was inside, phone in her lap, and a folder full of fake documents in the back seat. She didn't resist arrest. She didn't say much at all, just sat there, staring straight ahead as reality crashed down on her. She'd tried to set a trap. But instead, she stepped into one built by professionals, and this time there were cameras everywhere, just not the ones she controlled.